The moment I walked in and saw my girlfriend massaging our roommate's oily, naked back, I should have screamed. But I froze. She didn't even stop, she just looked me dead in the eye and told me that winners need care. Now, my suitcases are in the hallway, she is answering the door wearing his jersey, and she just told me I no longer fit the food chain. This is how I lost everything to a stranger in just 7 days. The suffocating heat in the dormitory room was typical of this season in the southern hemisphere. The ceiling fan churned the thick air with lazy indifference, offering no relief to us. I arranged my textbooks on my half of the desk with meticulous care, aligning the spines into a perfect row. It was my way of imposing order on the chaos of this new life on another continent, a small gesture of control in an environment that felt increasingly beyond my grasp. She sat on the bed, legs swinging idly, gazing out the window at the sprawling campus that drowned in the lush green of palm trees and flowering jacarandas. In the distance, blue mountains rose against the horizon like painted backdrop scenery. She seemed out of place here, too fragile and pale for this riot of colors and sounds that pulsed through the tropical air. We had come here on an exchange program, driven by dreams of academic achievement and exotic adventure, but so far we had found only oppressive humidity and a cramped room meant for two. The door exploded open without warning, slamming against the wall with a bang that sounded like a gunshot. A figure filled the doorway, blocking the light from the corridor behind him. It was our roommate. He had just returned from practice, standing tall with skin the color of ebony wood, gleaming with sweat, wearing a basketball jersey that barely concealed the sculpted muscles of his shoulders. A sharp, animal scent of strength and heated flesh radiated from him, instantly flooding the small space and displacing the smell of old books and deodorant that I had tried to maintain. The roommate tossed his sports bag onto his bed with casual possession and nodded toward me, but his eyes lingered on my girlfriend with a long, appraising look. She stopped swinging her legs and froze, unconsciously tugging at the hem of her short dress. The movement drew his attention downward for a fraction of a second before his gaze returned to her face. There was something predatory in that look, something that made the air feel even heavier than the tropical heat already had. He flashed a wide smile, revealing teeth so brilliantly white they seemed to glow against his dark skin. He said something in local slang, words that didn't sound like a greeting but rather like a declaration of territorial ownership over the space. His voice was deep and confident, resonating through the cramped quarters with the kind of ease that comes from never having been challenged. He moved toward his side of the room with the fluid grace of an athlete, each step deliberate and powerful. I felt a strange prick of unease watching my girlfriend's reaction to this display. Her pupils had dilated noticeably, and her breathing had changed rhythm as her eyes tracked the droplets of sweat that ran down the athlete's powerful chest. The beads of moisture caught the light from the window, creating tiny points of brilliance against that expanse of dark, glistening skin. She swallowed visibly, and her fingers tightened on the edge of her dress. I wanted to say something significant, something that would establish my presence and authority in this suddenly charged atmosphere. Words formed in my mind, statements that would mark my territory and remind everyone of the relationships in this room. But when I opened my mouth, all that emerged was a quiet, almost timid question about the class schedule. My voice came out thin and uncertain, lacking any of the weight I had intended. The question disappeared into the sudden blast of hip-hop music that the roommate had switched on, the bass throbbing through the walls and floor, making everything vibrate with its aggressive rhythm. He peeled off his sweat-soaked jersey in one smooth motion, revealing the full architecture of his torso, and reached for a towel. She was still watching, transfixed, her earlier interest in the view outside the window completely forgotten. I turned back to my textbooks, trying to focus on the aligned spines, but the perfect order I had created now seemed meaningless and small. The days at the African campus dragged on slowly, thick as molasses. The sun here was merciless, burning away any thoughts except the desperate desire to find shade. I spent all my time in the university library, an old colonial-era building that smelled of dust and dry paper. The high ceilings and thick stone walls offered sanctuary from the brutal heat outside. I diligently transcribed lectures, copying notes with the kind of obsessive attention to detail that comes from anxiety, trying to justify the grant that had allowed both of us to come here. Every line I wrote felt like a small debt repaid, a justification for our presence on this foreign continent. My girlfriend, however, had quickly lost interest in her studies. She complained of headaches from reading, claiming the small print in the textbooks made her eyes hurt and her temples throb. She stayed in the dormitory instead, insisting that it was better for her to study in the cool comfort of our room. I had believed her at first, had even felt guilty about leaving her alone while I buried myself in academic work. But as the days accumulated into weeks, her excuses became more frequent and her actual studying seemed to diminish until it disappeared entirely. Her textbooks remained closed on her desk, gathering a fine layer of dust that she never seemed to notice. When I returned in the evenings, exhausted and soaked through with sweat from the walk across campus in the lingering heat, I often found them together. The scene had become familiar, almost ritualistic in its repetition. Malik, our roommate, would be sprawled on his bed on top of the covers, his massive frame seeming to occupy half the room. His presence was magnetic, impossible to ignore, drawing the eye and dominating the space with an effortless authority. She would be sitting at her desk, but her chair was always turned away from her books, angled toward him instead. The positioning was deliberate, intimate in a way that made something twist uncomfortably in my stomach. They always fell silent when I entered. The conversation would cut off mid-sentence, leaving words hanging in the air like smoke. The sudden quiet was more damning than any words could have been, creating a void that I had to step into, feeling like an intruder in my own room. Malik would nod at me with lazy acknowledgement, nothing overtly disrespectful, but there was something proprietary in that nod, something that suggested he was the one granting permission for the intrusion. She would turn to face me with a delayed reaction, as though pulling herself back from somewhere far away. The room was always filled with a thick, heavy atmosphere, a particular mixture of scents that I came to recognize and dread. Expensive masculine cologne, the kind that costs a week's worth of meal money, mingled with her perfume, the light floral scent I had given her for her birthday. Underneath those deliberate fragrances was something else, something more primal and undeniable. It was the elusive smell of heated bodies, the musk that lingers in locker rooms after an important match, the scent of exertion and proximity, and something I couldn't quite name but recognized on an instinctive level. The air felt charged with it, saturated with an energy that made my skin prickle. She would greet me with an absent smile, her attention still partially elsewhere even as her eyes focused on my face. Her cheeks were always flushed with a strange brightness, a glow that made her look feverish and vital at the same time. When I asked about it, concerned at first that she might actually be ill, she blamed the African sun. But she had spent the entire day indoors, away from that merciless heat, and her explanation made no sense. I wanted to challenge this obvious lie, to demand the truth about what caused the telltale flush, but the words stuck in my throat, choked by cowardice and the terrible fear of what the answer might be. Malik had a way of looking at her that made everything else in the room disappear. His eyes would track her movements with predatory focus when she stood to get water or adjust the fan. There was hunger in that gaze, raw and unapologetic, the kind of desire that doesn't bother hiding itself because it knows it has already won. And she responded to it, her body language changing subtly but unmistakably when she felt those eyes on her. Her spine would straighten, her hips would sway just slightly more, her movements becoming unconsciously performative. It was like watching a dance where I wasn't invited to participate, only to observe from the sidelines. One evening, I returned earlier than usual, my study session cut short by a power outage that had plunged the library into darkness. I climbed the stairs to our floor, my footsteps echoing in the concrete stairwell, and approached the room with my key already in hand. But I paused outside the door when I heard laughter from within, her laughter, bright and unrestrained in a way I hadn't heard in weeks. It was the sound of genuine joy, uninhibited and free, and it pierced me because I couldn't remember the last time I had made her laugh like that. I stood there frozen, key hovering near the lock, listening to the sound of her happiness with another man. When I finally entered, the laughter died instantly. She was sitting on Malik's bed, not her own, perched on the edge with her legs crossed. The position was casual, too familiar, suggesting this wasn't the first time she had claimed that space. Malik was shirtless, wearing only basketball shorts, his skin gleaming in the golden light of late afternoon that slanted through the window. He was showing her something on his phone, their heads bent close together, and when she looked up at the interruption, there was a flash of something in her eyes. Annoyance, perhaps, or guilt, or both, quickly masked by that same distracted smile she always wore when I appeared. She stood up quickly, too quickly, smoothing her dress as though erasing evidence of something. The movement was reflexive, defensive, and it told me everything I was trying so hard not to see. Malik remained where he was, utterly relaxed, scrolling through his phone with the air of someone who had nothing to hide and nothing to fear. The contrast between her nervous energy and his calm confidence was stark and telling. I wanted to ask what was so funny, what they had been looking at that provoked such unbridled laughter, but I couldn't form the question. Instead, I mumbled something about the power outage and moved to my desk, turning my back to them both. The pattern continued and intensified. I would wake in the mornings to find Malik already awake, doing push-ups on the floor between our beds, his muscles flexing with mechanical precision. Sweat would drip from his body onto the tile, creating small dark pools, and she would watch from her bed through half-closed eyes, pretending to still be asleep. But I could see her gaze tracking each movement, following the rise and fall of that powerful body with fascinated attention. When Malik finished and stood, he would catch her looking and smile knowingly, a silent communication passing between them that excluded me entirely. She would close her eyes quickly then, feigning sleep, but her flushed cheeks and rapid breathing betrayed her. Their conversations became increasingly strange to my ears. They spoke in references I didn't understand, inside jokes that had developed during all those hours alone together while I was buried in the library. Malik would say something in his deep, resonant voice, and she would dissolve into giggles, her hand flying to her mouth in delight. When I asked what was funny, they would try to explain, but the explanation was never as amusing as the original joke, and I was left feeling like an outsider in my own relationship. The exclusion was subtle but relentless, a slow erosion of my place in her world. I tried to spend more time in the room, cutting my library sessions short and returning earlier each day. But my presence seemed to create tension rather than alleviate it. She would sigh with poorly concealed impatience when I interrupted their conversations. Malik would greet me with increasing coolness, the initial veneer of friendly cohabitation wearing thin to reveal something more territorial underneath. The room that was supposed to be shared equally among three now felt like it belonged to two, and I was the third wheel, the unwanted addition to a partnership that was forming without my consent and despite my proximity. One night, I woke to whispered voices in the darkness. The room was lit only by the glow of streetlights filtering through the thin curtains. I lay perfectly still, my eyes closed, listening. Malik was speaking softly, his deep voice barely audible but unmistakably intimate in tone. And she was responding, her voice breathy and quiet, filled with a warmth and engagement I rarely heard anymore when she spoke to me. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone told me everything. They were having the kind of late-night conversation that people have when they're getting to know each other on a deeper level, when attraction transforms into something more substantial. I wanted to sit up, to turn on the light and break whatever was happening in that darkness. But I remained frozen, paralyzed by cowardice and the terrible certainty that intervening would only make things worse. Instead, I lay there in my bed, pretending to sleep, while my girlfriend whispered to another man in the dark just meters away. The conversation lasted for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. When it finally ended, I heard the creak of bed springs as she settled back into her own bed, and then silence filled the room again, heavy with everything unspoken and everything I was too afraid to confront. One afternoon, the lecture was cancelled due to broken air conditioners in the main building. The announcement came just as I was settling into my seat, and the disappointed groans of students filled the sweltering lecture hall. I gathered my belongings and made my way back across campus, cutting through the shaded pathways between buildings, arriving at the dormitory much earlier than usual. The sun was still high and brutal, turning the concrete walkways into rivers of heat that shimmered and distorted the air. The door to our room was unlocked. I turned the handle and pushed it open quietly, my footsteps soft on the worn linoleum that had been scuffed and faded by years of student traffic. The floor was cool against my shoes, a small mercy in the oppressive heat. I stepped inside, and immediately sensed that something was different, that I was entering a space that had been transformed in my absence into something private and exclusive. The curtains had been drawn across the window, creating an intimate twilight that protected against the midday glare. The room was bathed in amber half-light, warm and golden, the kind of atmospheric dimness that softens edges and makes everything seem dreamlike and unreal. The fan continued its lazy rotation overhead, but it seemed quieter now, more conspiratorial, as though it too was part of whatever was happening in this deliberately darkened space. The air was thick and still, heavy with heat and something else, something charged and expectant. Malik stood in the center of the room, holding a basketball in his large hands. He wore only loose shorts that hung low on his hips, and nothing else. His torso was completely bare, revealing the full architecture of his athletic body in that honeyed light. Sweat gleamed on his dark skin, highlighting every contour of muscle, every ridge and valley of his chest and abdomen. The basketball rested against his hip casually, as though he had been demonstrating some move or technique, explaining the mechanics of the game. She stood next to him, far too close for ordinary conversation. The distance between their bodies was minimal, intimate, the kind of proximity that happens only between people who are comfortable with each other's physical presence. In her hands, she held a measuring tape, the flexible yellow ribbon stretched taut between her fingers. She was supposedly measuring the span of his arms for some anthropology project, but the academic justification felt thin and transparent, an excuse that barely concealed the real purpose of this exercise. Her fingers touched his damp, dark skin with deliberate slowness, lingering on his biceps far longer than any measurement required. She traced the curve of muscle with the tape, but also with her fingertips, exploring the topography of his body with barely disguised fascination. The measuring tape was just a prop, a permission slip that allowed her hands to travel across forbidden territory. Her touch was light but purposeful, mapping the dimensions of his strength with a concentration that suggested this was about more than data collection. Malik looked down at her with the lazy superiority of a predator allowing itself to be petted. There was amusement in his eyes, and satisfaction, and a kind of patient hunger that knew it would eventually be fed. He remained perfectly still under her ministrations, his muscles relaxed but ready, like a cat being stroked by someone it has decided to tolerate. The basketball shifted slightly against his hip as he breathed, and the movement drew her attention downward briefly before her eyes returned to her supposed task. When I cleared my throat to announce my presence, they didn't spring apart like guilty children caught in mischief. There was no startled jump, no panicked scramble to create distance. Instead, their movements were smooth and languid, deliberately unhurried. They turned toward me with synchronized casualness, as though my arrival was expected and unremarkable, as though I were the one intruding on something natural and established rather than discovering something that should have made them ashamed. She slowly withdrew her hands from Malik's body, the measuring tape trailing through her fingers like a yellow ribbon unwinding. But in her eyes, when they met mine, there was unmistakable annoyance at the interrupted moment. Not guilt, not embarrassment, but irritation that I had arrived before she was finished. The look lasted only a fraction of a second before she rearranged her expression into something more neutral, but I had seen it clearly. That flash of resentment told me more than any words could have about where her loyalties were shifting. She explained that they were just debating the physical parameters of professional athletes. Her voice was steady, practiced, as though she had prepared this explanation in advance. She gestured with the measuring tape as she spoke, using it as evidence of innocent academic inquiry. Malik nodded in confirmation, adding something about biomechanics and performance statistics, his deep voice lending false credibility to the fiction they were constructing together. They were united in this deception, partners in creating a plausible narrative that would let them all pretend nothing inappropriate was happening. But the air around them vibrated with unspoken tension, thick and electric like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm. I could feel it against my skin, could taste it in the back of my throat. The room felt charged with all the things they weren't saying, with all the touches that hadn't yet happened but would inevitably occur. The sexual tension was so palpable it seemed to have physical weight, pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe normally or think clearly about what I was witnessing. I felt myself to be a superfluous element in this equation, an unwanted variable disrupting a formula that was working perfectly well without me. I was a spectator who had wandered into a cinema midway through the film, trying to piece together a plot that everyone else already understood. The story was unfolding without my input or consent, and my role had been reduced to that of passive observer, someone who watches but doesn't participate, who sees but has no power to change what he's seeing. Malik stretched his arms above his head, a gesture that seemed casual but was clearly performative. The movement made every muscle in his torso flex and shift, creating a display of physical power that dominated the small room. She watched this display with undisguised appreciation, her eyes traveling over his body with the kind of open hunger that she used to reserve for me in their early days together. The measuring tape hung forgotten in her hand now, its ostensible purpose abandoned in favor of simple observation and admiration. I stood near the door, my hand still on the handle, unsure whether to enter fully or retreat back into the hallway. The room felt different now, transformed into territory that no longer belonged to me. The furniture was the same, my belongings were still arranged on my desk, but the space itself had been claimed by these two people who seemed to share a secret language and understanding that excluded me completely. I was a tenant in my own room, their unsufferance, tolerated but not welcomed. She moved away from Malik finally, crossing to her desk and draping the measuring tape over the back of her chair. She sat down and opened a textbook, assuming the posture of studious concentration, but the performance was unconvincing. The book was upside down, I noticed, though she didn't seem to realize it. Her attention was still on Malik, who had picked up a towel and was wiping the sweat from his chest with slow, deliberate movements that seemed designed to draw and hold the eye. I forced myself to move deeper into the room, to reclaim some portion of my own space. I set my bag down on my bed and pulled out my laptop, trying to establish normalcy through routine actions. But my hands were shaking slightly, and I had trouble with the zipper. The small fumble felt like a defeat, a visible sign of my nervousness and inadequacy compared to the confident masculinity that Malik radiated simply by existing in the same space. The afternoon dragged on with excruciating slowness. I tried to focus on reading assignments, but the words blurred on the screen. Every sound in the room seemed magnified, the rustle of fabric when Malik shifted position on his bed, the soft sigh she made when turning a page, the creak of springs and whisper of movement. I was hyper-aware of their presence, of the currents flowing between them, of my own isolation from whatever was developing in the close quarters of this room. As evening approached, Malik announced he was going to shower. He gathered his things and left, and the room seemed to exhale with his departure, the tension dissipating slightly. She immediately turned to face me, and I expected some acknowledgement of what had happened, some explanation or apology. But instead, she asked with barely concealed impatience when I would be going to dinner, whether I planned to eat in the cafeteria or stay in the room. The question was pointed, clearly hoping for a specific answer. I said I would probably go to the cafeteria later. She nodded, and I could see the calculation in her eyes, the silent measuring of time frames and opportunities. She was planning the hours when I would be gone, anticipating the freedom my absence would provide. The realization hit me with physical force, like a blow to the chest. She was waiting for me to leave, counting the minutes until she could be alone with Malik again, picking up whatever had been interrupted by my untimely arrival. When Malik returned from the shower, water still dripping from his hair, wearing only a towel wrapped around his waist, she brightened visibly. Her whole demeanor changed, her body language opening and becoming animated. They resumed their conversation about nothing, their voices low and intimate, punctuated by her laughter. I sat at my desk, facing the wall, listening to the sound of my relationship ending in real time, unable to stop it or even acknowledge it directly, trapped in a nightmare of my own cowardice. That evening, the campus erupted in celebration of the local team's victory. Drums thundered across the grounds, their deep rhythmic pulse seeming to come from the earth itself. Students danced directly on the grass under the starlit sky of the Southern Cross, that distinctive constellation that marked this hemisphere as alien and far from home. The air was thick with excitement and the smell of grilling meat from impromptu barbecues. Bonfires had been lit in designated areas, their flames reaching toward the darkness, casting dancing shadows that made everything seem to move and shift even when standing still. Malik was the hero of the evening. He had scored the winning points in the final seconds of the game, and his name was chanted by clusters of students throughout the celebration. He moved through the crowd with the grace of a panther, fluid and powerful, accepting congratulations and admiring looks as his natural due. People reached out to touch him as he passed, to slap his shoulder or shake his hand, wanting to share in his moment of glory. He responded to each gesture with easy confidence, his smile bright and genuine, a man completely at ease in his dominance. I stood off to the side, away from the main circle of dancers and celebrants, holding a warm soda in my hand. The bottle had been cold when I bought it from a vendor, but the heat of the evening had quickly stolen its chill, leaving me with something tepid and unrefreshing. I sipped it anyway, needing something to do with my hands, some action that would make me look occupied rather than abandoned. I watched the celebration unfold before me like a spectator at a show I hadn't bought tickets for. My girlfriend was there, in the center of the circle, right next to Malik. She had changed into a dress I hadn't seen before, something short and bright that caught the firelight and clung to her body when she moved. She laughed louder than everyone else, her voice carrying across the crowd with a joy and freedom I rarely heard anymore. Her body moved in time with Malik's movements, their dancing synchronized as though they had been practicing together, as though they were tuned to the same frequency that was inaccessible to outsiders and especially to me. The way she danced was different from anything I had seen from her before. There was abandon in her movements, a sensuality and confidence that seemed to have emerged fully formed in the presence of this man and this place. Her hips swayed to the African rhythms with natural ease, as though she had always known these steps, as though the reserve she showed in her life with me had been only a temporary constraint that she was now joyfully shedding. She belonged in this circle in a way I never could, and watching her transformation was like watching her become a stranger. At one point, Malik placed his heavy palm on the back of her neck, a gesture of unmistakable possession. His large hand wrapped around her slender neck completely, his fingers dark against her pale skin. He pulled her closer to him with that proprietary touch, drawing her into his orbit, and leaned down to whisper something directly into her ear. His lips brushed against her hair as he spoke, intimate and deliberate. Whatever he said made her throw her head back and laugh, looking up at him with unconcealed adoration shining in her eyes. The look she gave him was devastating in its transparency. It was the look of someone falling, of someone who had already surrendered to inevitability and was embracing it with relief and excitement. There was worship in that gaze, and desire, and a kind of grateful submission that acknowledged a superior force. She looked at Malik the way she had once looked at me in those early days of our relationship, except this was more intense, more primal, stripped of the civilized pretense that had characterized our courtship. This was raw attraction unfiltered by social convention. I tried to approach them, to insert myself into their circle, to reclaim my place beside her. I moved forward through the crowd, navigating between dancing bodies, my determination warring with my anxiety. When I reached her, I attempted to take her hand, to establish physical connection and remind her of our bond. But she gently yet firmly pulled her palm away from my grasp, her fingers slipping through mine like water. She didn't even look at me as she did it, her eyes remaining fixed on Malik, as though the interruption had barely registered in her consciousness. The rejection was so casual it hurt more than an angry confrontation would have. She hadn't needed to think about it or make a conscious choice. The withdrawal of her hand had been automatic, reflexive, her body making the decision before her mind could process it. I stood there awkwardly, my empty hand still extended for a moment before I let it drop to my side. Around us, the celebration continued unaware, the drums pounding and voices raised in song and laughter, but I felt frozen in a pocket of isolation. I stood there in the midst of the pulsing African night, acutely aware of my own otherness. I was a white American in glasses and a wrinkled shirt that had wilted in the heat. My clothes marked me as foreign, my posture as uncomfortable, my very presence as incongruous with the energy surrounding me. The music that moved through everyone else seemed to stop at my body, unable to penetrate, leaving me still and awkward while the world danced. I felt the invisible wall that had been building between me and my girlfriend solidify into an unbridgeable chasm. The realization settled over me with terrible finality. I had lost her, or perhaps had never truly had her in the first place. What I had mistaken for love might have been only convenience, proximity, a relationship born of familiarity rather than passion. And now she had discovered what real desire felt like, what it meant to be drawn to someone with magnetic inevitability, and there was no competing with that. I could see my own obsolescence reflected in her eyes every time she looked at Malik instead of me. I turned away from the celebration and walked back toward the dormitory building. My footsteps were heavy and slow, each one an effort of will. Behind me, the sounds of the party continued undiminished, the drums and laughter and music following me across the campus like mockery. The path was lit by intermittent lamps that created pools of light separated by stretches of darkness. I walked through these alternating zones mechanically, my mind numb with the shock of what I had just witnessed and what it meant for my future. The dormitory was nearly empty, most students still outside celebrating. The hallways were quiet and dim, the silence oppressive after the noise of the party. I climbed the stairs to our floor, my hand trailing along the railing for support, and unlocked the door to our room. The space was dark and still, exactly as we had left it hours earlier. I didn't bother turning on the lights, just navigated by memory to my bed and lay down fully clothed on top of the covers. I stared at the ceiling, where the rotating fan created shifting patterns of shadow. Through the open window came the sounds of the celebration, distant but clear. I could hear the drums still pounding their primal rhythm, could hear the occasional shout of joy or burst of laughter. I listened for her voice among the others but couldn't distinguish it from the general cacophony. I waited for her to return, checking my phone periodically to see if she had sent any message, but the screen remained blank. Hours passed with agonizing slowness. The sounds of the party gradually diminished as the night wore on, the music becoming more sporadic, the voices fewer. Eventually, there was mostly silence, broken only by the occasional distant laugh or call. I dozed intermittently, falling into shallow, troubled sleep and waking with a start, hoping to find her returned. But her bed remained empty, the covers undisturbed, her absence a physical presence in the room. The sky outside the window began to lighten with the approach of dawn, that gradual shift from black to deep blue to pale gray that precedes sunrise. I was still awake, still waiting, exhausted but unable to sleep properly. My eyes burned with fatigue and unshed tears that I refused to let fall. I heard footsteps in the hallway, slow and unsteady, and my heart began to pound. The door handle turned and the door opened, and she slipped inside. She moved quietly, trying not to wake me, unaware that I had never slept. In the dim pre-dawn light, I could see her silhouette as she crossed to her bed. She smelled of bonfire smoke, that acrid woody scent that clings to clothes and hair. But underneath it was something else, a masculine musk that wasn't mine, the smell of sweat and cologne and intimate proximity. The scent filled the room as she passed my bed, undeniable evidence of where she had been and what she had been doing. She lay down on her bed without changing clothes or washing, too tired or too indifferent to go through her usual nighttime routine. She turned immediately to face the wall, her back to the room, her body curling into itself. Within minutes, her breathing had deepened into the regular rhythm of sleep. She fell asleep easily, without apparent guilt or anxiety, as though nothing extraordinary had happened. I lay there as the day began, but nothing felt new or fresh. Instead, everything felt tainted and ruined, transformed by the events of the night into something unrecognizable. I continued to lie there motionless, staring at the ceiling, while she slept peacefully beside me, and the distance between our two beds felt like the width of an ocean. A week later, I returned early again. I had forgotten my lecture notes, essential documents I needed for the afternoon seminar. The realization had hit me halfway across campus, and I had hurried back to retrieve them, cursing my own absent-mindedness. As I approached the door to our room, I heard a sound that made me freeze in the hallway. It was a quiet, rhythmic moan, but this wasn't the sound of pain. It was something else entirely, something that made my stomach clench with dread and anticipation. My hand stopped on the door handle, hovering there as I tried to process what I was hearing. Part of me wanted to turn around and walk away, to leave whatever was happening undiscovered and undisturbed. But a larger part, the part that needed to know the truth even if it destroyed me, pushed the door open. The hinges made a soft creaking sound as the door swung inward, revealing the interior of the room in the afternoon light that slanted through the partially closed curtains. The image that opened before me burned itself into my memory forever, searing into my consciousness with the permanence of a brand. Every detail was crystalline and sharp, too vivid to ever be forgotten or softened by time. This moment would define a before and after in my life, a clear demarcation between innocence and knowledge, between hope and despair. I would carry this scene with me always, replaying it in unwanted moments for years to come. Malik lay on his stomach on his bed, his massive frame occupying the entire mattress. He was completely naked except for a towel carelessly draped across his lower back and hips. The white terry cloth stood in stark contrast to his dark skin, drawing attention to rather than concealing what lay beneath. His muscles bunched and shifted under skin that gleamed with oil, each movement highlighting the sculpted perfection of his athletic body. The sheen made every contour more pronounced, turning his back into a landscape of valleys and ridges. My girlfriend sat astride Malik's thighs, her legs straddling his body in an unmistakably intimate position. She wore only a thin tank top and shorts, her own skin glistening with perspiration from her exertion. Her palms, shiny with massage oil, slid across his broad back with forceful pressure, working the powerful knots of muscle along his spine. Her fingers dug deep into his flesh, kneading and manipulating with practiced intensity, as though she had done this many times before and knew exactly where to apply pressure. She moved rhythmically, her entire body weight pressing down through her hands with each stroke. There was frightening dedication in her movements, a kind of worship in the way she ministered to his body. She looked like a priestess performing some ancient ritual of devotion, her concentration absolute, her touch both therapeutic and caressing. The line between massage and something more intimate had blurred beyond recognition, and watching her hands move across his skin felt voyeuristic and violating. Malik lay motionless beneath her ministrations, his face buried in the pillow, only occasionally releasing a low guttural sound of pleasure. The noise vibrated through the stale, hot air of the room, primal and animal. It was the sound a man makes when his body is being satisfied, when tension is being released through skilled touch. Each groan seemed to resonate in the confined space, filling it with undeniable evidence of his enjoyment and her ability to provide it. His skin gleamed and glistened under the oil she had applied so liberally. Against the backdrop of pristine white sheets, his body seemed enormous and alien, overwhelming in its physical power. The contrast between the dark expanse of his muscled back and the pale fabric beneath him was almost obscene in its starkness. He looked like some kind of predatory animal at rest, dangerous even in repose, capable of explosive violence or equally explosive passion at any moment. I stood frozen in the doorway, unable to draw breath, feeling cold sweat break out across my back despite the heat of the afternoon. My body had gone into shock, systems shutting down as my mind tried to process what my eyes were seeing. Time seemed to stretch and distort, each second lasting an eternity while simultaneously passing too quickly. I wanted to look away but couldn't, my gaze locked on the scene before me with horrible fascination. The folder containing my forgotten notes slipped from my hands and hit the floor with a dull thud, the sound cutting through the thick silence of the room. Papers scattered across the linoleum, sliding in different directions, but I didn't bend to retrieve them. The noise violated the intimate atmosphere that had filled the space, announcing my presence and shattering whatever bubble they had created in my absence. The sound made her turn her head to look at me, but she didn't jump up as though stung. There was no guilty scramble, no panicked attempt to create distance or cover herself. She didn't pull her hands away from Malik's body or try to justify what she was doing. Instead, she merely looked at me over her shoulder with an expression of cold composure, in which I could read mild annoyance at the interruption, as though I had barged in on an important medical procedure rather than something deeply, undeniably intimate. Her reaction was somehow worse than any display of guilt would have been. The calm acceptance in her eyes, the lack of shame or fear, told me that she had moved beyond caring what I thought. She had crossed a threshold where my approval or disapproval no longer mattered, where she had given herself permission to do whatever she wanted regardless of how it affected me. She had already left our relationship in every way that mattered, only the formal acknowledgement remained. I forced a question out of my constricted throat, my voice trembling and breaking, sounding pathetic in this testosterone-saturated atmosphere. The words came out higher-pitched than I intended, almost childlike in their plaintive confusion. I asked what the hell was going on here, though the answer was obvious to anyone with eyes. The question hung in the air, inadequate and weak, demanding an explanation I wasn't sure I actually wanted to hear. She sighed, a sound of exasperation and weariness, as though I were being deliberately obtuse about something perfectly obvious and reasonable. She used the back of her oil-slicked hand to push a strand of hair off her forehead, the gesture casual and unconcerned. Then she answered in the tone one uses to explain simple truths to an unreasonable child, her voice patient but condescending, making it clear that my inability to understand reflected poorly on my intelligence and maturity. She explained that Malik had severe muscle spasms after yesterday's game, and he needed help to recover properly before the season finals. Her tone suggested this was self-evident, that any reasonable person would understand the necessity of what she was doing. She spoke as though she were performing an act of medical charity rather than engaging in behavior that betrayed our relationship. The justification was so transparent, so obviously a constructed rationalization, that it insulted my intelligence even as she delivered it with complete sincerity. A winner's muscles require care, she stated firmly, looking me directly in the eyes as she said it. In that phrase, in the way she pronounced the word winner with such reverence and emphasis, there was more intimacy and admiration than in any conversation we had shared over the past 2 years. The word carried weight and meaning beyond its literal definition. It was a judgment and a comparison, a statement about who deserved attention and devotion and who did not. She had chosen her winner, and it wasn't me. Without waiting for my response, she turned back to her task, her attention immediately returning to Malik as though I had ceased to exist. Her fingers greedily pressed into the dark skin once more, resuming their rhythmic work with renewed intensity. She leaned forward, putting more weight behind her strokes, and I heard Malik release another satisfied groan into the pillow. She smiled at that sound, pleased with herself, with her ability to draw such responses from this powerful body. I stood there watching my girlfriend ignore my presence, massage oil dripping slowly from her hands onto Malik's glistening back. I had become nothing in my own room, a non-entity whose existence didn't merit acknowledgement or explanation. She had dismissed me without words, relegating me to the status of irrelevant observer. The dismissal was absolute and devastating, more painful than any argument or accusation could have been. Malik shifted slightly under her touch, turning his head to the side so his profile was visible. His eyes opened lazily, meeting my gaze with undisguised satisfaction and triumph. There was no apology in that look, no embarrassment or concern. Instead, there was challenge and possession, a silent communication that said, "This is mine now, and there's nothing you can do about it." The look lasted only a moment before his eyes closed again in pleasure as her hands found a particularly tight muscle. I wanted to shout, to demand she stop, to physically pull her away from Malik's body. I wanted to assert some claim, some right to her attention and loyalty. But the words wouldn't come, paralyzed by the certainty that any protest would be futile and would only make me look more pathetic. She had made her choice clear through action rather than declaration, and forcing a confrontation would only result in having my worst fears confirmed aloud. Instead, I bent slowly and gathered my scattered notes from the floor, my movements mechanical and numb. My hands shook as I collected the papers, putting them back in order with meticulous care that contrasted sharply with the chaos in my mind. The simple task gave me something to focus on, a reason to keep my eyes down and away from the scene on the bed. When I straightened with my folder clutched to my chest like a shield, they were still in the same position. She continued her massage with total concentration, her hands moving in long, sensual strokes from Malik's shoulders down to the small of his back where the towel rested. Each stroke seemed to last longer than necessary, her palms lingering on his skin with obvious pleasure. Malik lay passive and receptive, accepting her worship as his natural due. I backed toward the door, unable to turn away from them completely, as though turning my back might result in something even worse happening. My hand found the door handle behind me and I pulled it open, the same creaking hinge announcing my departure as had announced my arrival. Neither of them looked up or acknowledged that I was leaving. I stepped back into the hallway and pulled the door closed behind me with a soft click that sounded like finality. The next morning began without explanations and without apologies. I woke on the narrow, hard couch in the dormitory lobby where I had fled the previous night, unable to remain in that room saturated with the smell of oil, betrayal, and someone else's passion. My head was splitting, my body aching from the uncomfortable position I had maintained through the restless hours. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with mechanical indifference, and early morning cleaners moved around me with mops and buckets, casting disapproving glances at the disheveled foreign student who had spent the night on their furniture. I decided this was the end, the absolute limit of what I could tolerate. Enough was enough, and I would no longer be passive in my own destruction. I would return to the room, gather my belongings, force her to leave with me or demand immediate relocation through the university administration. There had to be rules, procedures, protections for students in situations like this. I couldn't be simply displaced from my own paid accommodation without recourse or remedy. I climbed the stairs to my floor, my footsteps heavy with determination and righteous anger. I rehearsed the confrontation in my mind, preparing to finally speak all the accumulated grievances and hurt that had been building for weeks. I would be firm but reasonable, would appeal to whatever remained of the person she had been before Malik had entered our lives. Surely some remnant of our shared history still existed, some foundation of affection that could be leveraged into a reasonable resolution. But outside the door to our room, positioned directly in the corridor like discarded trash, stood my 2 suitcases. The sight stopped me mid-stride, my prepared speech dying in my throat. All my possessions had been carelessly crumpled and stuffed inside, shirt sleeves protruding from the edges, zippers straining and partially open from hasty packing. The message was unmistakable and brutal in its clarity. I had been ejected, removed, eliminated from the equation without consultation or negotiation. The door was locked. I knocked, softly at first, then harder, feeling panic rising in my chest like floodwater. My knuckles rapped against the wood with increasing desperation, the sound echoing down the empty hallway. Other students' doors remained closed, either empty or deliberately ignoring the disturbance. I was alone with this humiliation, performing my rejection for an audience that preferred not to witness it. The lock clicked and the door opened, but only the length of the security chain allowed. The narrow dark gap revealed my girlfriend's face, partially illuminated by the light from the hallway. She looked fresh, well-rested, and frighteningly calm. There was no trace of guilt or anxiety in her expression, no indication that she found anything unusual or problematic about the situation. Her composure was more devastating than anger would have been. She was wearing Malik's oversized basketball jersey, the fabric hanging loose on her slender frame like a banner of conquered territory. The number on the front was clearly visible, that same number the crowd had chanted during the celebration. The jersey swallowed her small body, the hem reaching mid-thigh, and the sight of her in his clothing felt like a desecration, a public claiming that erased any remaining ambiguity about where her loyalties now resided. She didn't open the door wider, blocking the passage with her body positioned in the gap. I tried to push against the door with my shoulder, demanding explanations, demanding access to my own room and my own belongings. But the door didn't budge even an inch. Behind her in the shadows, I could make out a massive silhouette, Malik's unmistakable form providing silent support for her decision. The physical barrier was reinforced by his presence, making it clear that force would not gain entry. She spoke quietly, keeping her voice low to avoid waking the entire dormitory, but each word landed with the weight of a dropped stone. She said they had discussed the situation, using the plural pronoun with casual ease that excluded me from the deliberations about my own life. The decision had been made without my input, in my absence, and was now being delivered as accomplished fact rather than proposal for negotiation. 3 people in one room is too crowded, she explained with the patience of someone stating the obvious. It interfered with Malik's routine and training regimen. He needed proper rest, space, and quiet before the crucial games coming up, and the presence of an outsider created unnecessary tension. The way she said, outsider, applying that label to me rather than to Malik, the actual third party in our original arrangement, revealed how completely the hierarchy had been inverted. I stared at her in stunned incomprehension, unable to process how she could evict me from a room I had paid for, from a country I had brought her to. The injustice of it was staggering, the reversal of reality so complete it bordered on gaslighting. I reminded her of these facts, my voice rising despite myself. I spoke of the grant I had won, the tickets I had purchased, the relationship we had built over 2 years. Each point was delivered as irrefutable evidence of my priority and my rights. She merely shrugged, and in that gesture was the absolute indifference of nature toward the weak. Her shoulders rose and fell with casual dismissal of everything I had said, everything I thought mattered. The shrug communicated that all my appeals to history and investment and relationship were irrelevant in the face of present reality. The past had been rendered meaningless by the overwhelming force of the present. She answered that things change, and people find their true calling. Her voice carried the conviction of someone who had experienced revelation and wouldn't be argued out of it. She had found hers, she explained, and it was to be beside a champion, to support his fire and nurture his greatness. The religious language was striking, suggesting she saw her role not as girlfriend or even lover but as devotee to something larger than individual relationships. And you, she added, according to her assessment, have always been too dim for this continent. The word choice was deliberate and cutting. Not unsuited or incompatible, but dim, lacking in light and fire and vital energy. Too pale in every sense, too drained of color and passion to survive in this bright, intense landscape. She delivered this judgment with clinical detachment, as though commenting on an objective fact rather than destroying someone she had claimed to love. She reached through the gap in the door and placed an envelope on top of my suitcases. It was my return ticket, the date of which she had obviously changed online the previous evening while I slept fitfully in the lobby. The efficiency of it was remarkable and horrible. She had planned my departure, executed the logistics, and was now presenting me with the fait accompli. My agency in my own life had been completely usurped. So it will be better for everyone, she said, and in her voice was a note of that particular caring that had never been directed at me. It was the tone of someone making a difficult but necessary decision for the good of all parties, the benevolent cruelty of someone convinced they were acting mercifully. Winners have their own needs, she continued, and you simply don't fit into the food chain. The Darwinian language was stark and unforgiving, reducing our relationship to biological hierarchy where I occupied the bottom rung. She began closing the door, and I realized with sudden panic that this was actually happening, that she was truly ending things in this corridor conversation, that I would have no further chance to argue or plead or change the outcome. I put my hand out to stop the door's movement, but she had already started the motion and my resistance was futile against the combined force of her determination and Malik's weight behind the barrier. In the final second before the lock clicked shut, I saw Malik's large dark hand land on her waist with possessive certainty. Those fingers wrapped around her slender body, the contrast between his massive hand and her small frame somehow obscene in its visual representation of domination. The hand pulled her backward into the cool shadows of the room, reclaiming her from even this brief interaction with her former life. She went willingly, her body yielding to that backward pressure without resistance. In fact, she seemed to relax into it, to welcome the guidance back into the space they now shared exclusively. The last thing I saw was a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth, satisfaction at having handled an unpleasant task efficiently, relief at returning to where she wanted to be. The door slammed shut with decisive finality. The bolt slid home with a metallic clang that echoed in the hallway, punctuating the end of the conversation and the relationship. The sound was harsh and unambiguous, the auditory equivalent of a door slamming in my face, which is exactly what had just happened both literally and metaphorically. I stood alone in the stuffy, empty corridor, my hand still extended toward the now closed door. My 2 suitcases sat at my feet like loyal dogs waiting for instruction. The envelope with my modified ticket rested on top of the nearest one, a white rectangle that represented my ejection from this place and this life. Everything had ended as suddenly as it had begun, my African adventure collapsing in the space of a few weeks from hopeful beginning to humiliating conclusion. From behind the thin plywood partition came the sound of laughter. It was her laughter, bright and genuine, followed by Malik's deeper rumble of amusement. They were laughing together at something, perhaps at me, perhaps at something completely unrelated. The fact that I couldn't tell which was worse made it all more painful. They had already moved on, already resumed their private world that had no room for me. I heard other sounds too, the creak of bed springs, the low murmur of intimate conversation, the rustle of fabric and movement. Life was continuing on the other side of that door, a life that had been partially mine until moments ago and was now completely foreclosed. They were picking up exactly where they had been before my interruption, as though my entire existence was nothing more than a brief pause in their real story. I stood there for another minute, unable to move, hoping irrationally that the door would open again and she would emerge with an apology and an explanation that made sense. But the door remained closed and the sounds from within continued, domestic and intimate, the sounds of 2 people comfortable in shared space. Finally, my paralysis broke and I bent to pick up my suitcases. The handles were still warm from hasty packing, and I could feel through the fabric that my belongings had been thrown in without any care for order or preservation. Probably things were wrinkled and crushed, certainly nothing was folded properly. But that seemed like the least of my concerns now. I lifted both cases, one in each hand, and turned away from the door that would not open for me again. The walk down the corridor to the stairs felt impossibly long, each step requiring conscious effort and will. Other doors remained closed, but I felt eyes watching through peepholes, witnesses to my shame who would later discuss what they had seen or heard. My humiliation was public now, part of the dormitory gossip that would spread through the campus. The white exchange student who had been displaced by the local basketball star, a story with clear heroes and villains already assigned. I descended the stairs carefully, the weight of the suitcases making me unsteady. At the bottom, I paused in the lobby where I had spent the night, looking at the couch that still bore the impression of my body. The cleaning staff had moved on to other areas, leaving me alone with my luggage and my shattered pride. Through the windows, I could see the campus coming to life in the early morning light, students heading to breakfast and classes, continuing their normal routines while my world had ended.